I'm speaking with Dr. Roger Johnston. Um, Roger, you were the former head of the vulnerability assessment security teams at both Los Alamos and Argonne National Labs, and you've had 30 years in the security business and doing that. I'd like to talk to you about election security and ballot security because everything in the news would indicate that we're looking for a non-secure election. And you've had experience. You were actually, as I understand it, you were a judge for a while at election centers, ballot centers.
Yeah, I've actually had a lot of experience looking at election security. So I've done vulnerability assessments, both formal and informal, in a number of election jurisdictions. I've observed other election jurisdictions. I've served as an election judge for over 12 years, which is very educational if you want to understand election security. And I've talked to a lot of different people, have demonstrated attacks on voting machines that were non-cyber attacks. So I have looked a fair amount at security issues for elections.
And you led the teams at our national labs, one of which, of course, was famous for the Manhattan Project in New Mexico for the Department of Energy for most of your career. Is that correct?
Yeah, we've really looked at quite a range of different types of security, everything from nuclear safeguards to product tampering and counterfeiting, cargo security, warehouse and port security, GPS security, tags and seals, just on, all kinds of different types of security applications. And I think my experience has been that the same kinds of mistakes and wrong thinking show up across quite a wide range of different security applications, including election security. The real challenge with election security is you're, in many cases, not dealing really with people who think that they have a security issue, or when they think there is a security issue, they're still basically security amateurs. So that makes it particularly challenging to have good election security.
We always enjoyed the security theater video that your team at Los Alamos produced. I think it was Los Alamos. Regarding a lot of security theater that everybody thinks they have security, but it's not really.
And yeah, security theater is very seductive. The best way to understand if it's real security or fake security is to really do a vulnerability assessment. But if you don't want to go to that trouble, there's some sort of telltale signs. So security theater makes people feel good. It's kind of warm and fuzzy. If it's real security, it makes you feel bad because you fully understand the problems and the challenges and the vulnerabilities. So that's kind of a key point. If the election official is all happy about how good their security is, it's probably security theater. If they're sweating bullets, that's probably a good thing.
And you've written several books on the subject. Could you just tell me, and they're actually on our website as well, but could you just summarize for our readers the books that you've recently come out with?
I've just come out with a book called Vulnerability Assessment, the Missing Manual for the Missing Link. And it's based on my concern that a lot of security programs aren't really looking adequately at the security vulnerabilities, including for election security. I've also got a book called Security Soundbites, Important Ideas About Security from Smartass, Kickass, and Dumbass Quotations. It's mostly for fun, but it does make some serious points about security. And then I have the Devil's Dictionary of Security Terms, which is pure entertainment. It's a very kind of cynical take on how people use security terminology, but it's more for entertainment than making serious security points.
I can't imagine being cynical in the security business.
Yeah, hard to imagine, but actually it's kind of a occupational hazard of being a vulnerability assessment, as you well know. Having seen enough bad security culture, yeah, it's pretty easy to become cynical. But it's also very useful to at least be highly skeptical when you look at security, because then you don't buy into the hidden assumptions and the common mistakes that people make in thinking about security.
So let's talk about voting in this upcoming election. Vote by mail versus voting in person. From the security standpoint, which would you prefer?
I very much like voting by mail. I think in general, it's going to be more secure than even in-person voting. Now, that's a general statement. That doesn't mean there can't be election jurisdictions that have terrible security with vote by mail, or that there aren't election jurisdictions that maybe have pretty good security for in-person voting. But I think in general, it's easier to have good security with mail-in voting. So I'm not particularly concerned that it's going to be used increasingly in this upcoming election. I think it's actually a good thing.
And why do you think vote by mail is more secure? I mean, we've looked at it, and given the safeguards, at least in our state of South Dakota, which is a relatively small state, unless there's a conspiracy in the folks that administer and take the ballots, everything's registered ahead of time. There's no ballots that are just sent out that you can file.
Right. Now, I think that's indeed one of the advantages of mail-in voting. There's fewer insiders, and that reduces automatically the insider threat. So that is a good aspect. I would caution you, though, that there's somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 election jurisdictions in the United States. Doesn't seem to be any general agreement on the number. And they all tend to do everything differently, which is both a strength and a weakness of the U.S. election system. So it's hard to talk in general about vote by mail because all the states and the various counties and the other election jurisdictions are all tending to do different kinds of things. But in general, what I like about vote by mail is that you automatically have a voter verified paper record. So a lot of states, amazingly, still don't have a paper copy of how the voter voted that the voter can actually look at and go, yes, that's who I want to vote for. There's a lot of, for example, touchscreen voting machines still out there where some of them have a paper roll the voter can briefly look at, but others they don't. And so this automatically, if you do vote by mail, automatically provides a voter verified paper record, which is good for the voter to check that he or she marked things correctly, but it's also very good for doing auditing after the election. So you automatically get substantial better security there just from the vote in mailing.
But if you were going to look or advise a jurisdiction on making sure that their vote by mail systems and procedures were secure, what would you be looking at?
Well, first of all, I would do what Illinois, and I think it's something like 6 or 8 other states are doing, which is having your ballot tracking. So, and South Dakota, I believe, does this too.
We do that, yes.
So you can get online and you can see if you have requested a ballot, if for states where you have to request a ballot instead of just receiving one, you can see if anybody's turned the ballot in under your name, and then you can raise a ruckus if you didn't actually turn the ballot in yet. So that's a very good feature, but not all states are going to be doing that. But certainly that adds a substantial amount of security, because if I can ballot track, then it becomes much more difficult for an adversary to try to basically vote for people who don't vote. The other nice thing in terms of security about our upcoming election is there's going to be high voter turnout. And that makes it much harder to basically try to do any vote tampering. The funny thing about voting is that it's actually more secure with higher volumes, which is quite opposite from the way most security applications are. Most security applications are less secure when there's high volume. But with voting, we actually do better with high volume.
Yeah, because it's more difficult to affect the outcome.
Exactly. You have to have you have to attack more voting machines or have more vote tampering, and then you have a bigger conspiracy, and there's a greater chance someone will talk. And yeah, so generally, so that's one good aspect, particularly about the upcoming election.
And
the other thing is, like you point out, when you vote by mail, there's far fewer people handling the ballots, the voting machines, the election materials. Keep in mind, when you vote in person, there's an army of election judges, which I've been one myself, who are largely amateurs. They're semi-volunteers. They often get paid a little bit. But there's just an enormous number of people that are involved in this whole process. Most of them have not had a background check. Most of them, you don't really know very much who you're dealing with. And these people just essentially, many of them go away when you do vote by mail. So that automatically reduces the insider threat, which, as you point out, is probably the biggest threat to election security is from insiders. There's other threats, but typically the insiders are the ones that people should worry about the most, not some kind of cyber attack from Russia.
Well, when I looked at the procedures in detail in South Dakota, I interviewed the Secretary of State who handles the elections, of course, in our state. It occurs to me that the potential breakdown, but not likely, is when the election folks separate the ballot from the envelope that it was sent in, because there's no link between the ballot, obviously, and the envelope that's sent it in once you pull it apart. And if those were manipulated or destroyed, nobody would know, but there's always dual control over every one of these procedures. So it would be very difficult to do that with mail-in ballots. At least it occurs to me.
Well, I think that process doesn't really go away when you do in-person voting. There's essentially the equivalent, depending on what kind of voting machine you use. It's certainly a mode of attack, but I think it's a mode of attack for either kind of voting, in person or vote by mail. It just looks a little different. But certainly the insider threat at that point, it's not the only point where there's insider concern, but that's a very serious point. But in many cases with vote in mail, you at least are having the people doing that who are longtime professional employees. Hopefully there's been a background check on them. Now, that's inconsistent across election jurisdictions, as opposed to the people that are handling the election materials, setting up the voting machines, handling your ballot, providing you instructions at the polling place as to what to do with your ballot or with how you run the voting machine. These people haven't been checked out. They're not professionals. There's almost never any background checks on them. So I think the risk is far higher in the in-person voting than it is in the mail-in voting for this particular reason. But yet, there's still risk in either situation. The other concern that some people have, which is I think legitimate about vote-in mailing, is the privacy issue. So if I go to vote in person, pretty quickly there's a disconnection between my ballot and who I am, depending on the type of voting machine being used. But with mail-in balloting, my name is associated with that ballot for a very long time until, as you say, the envelope is actually open, at which point there's a separation between who I am and how I voted. So there's a little bit more of a privacy concern with vote by mail, but I don't think it's so substantial that we should be too concerned about it. There's certainly an opportunity to compromise privacy, which is different from compromising security. But I don't think it's worth. I think the security is largely more important. The other issue raised with elections is there's not just security and privacy. I can't have other people knowing how I voted because I don't want to be retaliated against. But also there's the issue of, can I prove to somebody who's bribing me how I voted? So the thing is, when I'm preparing my ballot at home for mail-in voting, I can take a picture of it. I can show somebody, look, I'm voting, and perhaps increase the odds of getting a payment for that. Now, when you do in-person voting, it's actually almost as easy because you've got pseudo-privacy in the voting booth there, and you can pull out your phone and take a picture anyway. So that issue I don't think is very different between voting in person and voting by mail. But I think there is a little bit of a privacy concern. But I think the improvement in security by voting by mail is definitely worth the slight increase in issues of privacy with voting by mail.
Would you be concerned about, there's been a lot of information floated around in social media about millions of counterfeit ballots.
Well, counterfeiting a ballot, depending on, again, exactly how the jurisdiction is doing it, would not be particularly effective. This is not an issue of counterfeiting the ballots. It's more a question of, are multiple people trying to vote under your name? That's what we're really looking for. Counterfeiting ballots actually is more useful in-person voting than it is in vote by mail. So I think it's kind of simple-minded to say an attack would involve counterfeiting ballots. No, that's not the way an attack would look like if you're trying to attack voting by mail.
Well, but the public has been led to believe that, especially foreign actors, can send millions of ballots into the system for essentially illegal voting. And the way I've looked at the states are set up, everything is pre-registered. So you can't get a ballot into the system unless there's an ID number assigned to it that the state has already issued.
Right. All you can really do as an adversary is vote for somebody who hasn't voted, or try to vote before they vote. A counterfeit ballot doesn't do anything for you. It accomplishes exactly nothing. But there are attacks for in-person voting where a counterfeit ballot is potentially useful. So yeah, but it's not the mode of attack that we should be particularly concerned about.
Well, in person, if you had a conspiracy with employers at a voting precinct, then if you had extra ballots, you could mark them all for one party or another candidate, and theoretically you could input them into the system. But that would take a lot of people to be involved in that. And there's serious penalties.
Well, yeah, we don't really prosecute vote tampering that well in the United States. We do somewhat. That's the other nice thing, though, about vote in mail. If you try to do fake voting with mail-in ballots, not only have you violated state and federal laws about tampering with elections, you've committed mail fraud. You've got the U.S. Postal Service inspectors who are very good coming after you. You've got potential trespassing and civil penalties if you've basically stolen ballots out of somebody's mailbox. So in many ways, you face far more penalty as an adversary trying to attack vote by mail than you actually would face in attacking the election in person voting.
So here's my last question. And I pose this to our Secretary of State. The security of these ballot collection boxes, which are not the United States Postal Service, these are essentially private boxes put out by the counties. Any thoughts? Because we wanted to look at the locks, which of course is our background, to see how secure these access to these containers are. The containers are pretty good, it looks like, but not so much the locks. Have you seen anything or experienced anything in that regard?
Well, I think it's clear the locks are typically a joke. But a lot of election jurisdictions are actually having an officer stand by that collection ballot. Now, there's potential issues there, voter intimidation, that kind of thing. Others have some video cameras on it, not particularly effective at stopping tampering, but might be useful for prosecuting it. But I think that is an issue. Now, a lot of election jurisdictions are really limiting the number of ballot boxes where you can drop off your ballot. So they're not typically placing hundreds of them all throughout the election jurisdiction. They may have it inside or just outside the county clerk's office. So I think a lot of election officials are cognizant that that's a serious issue. How well they're handling it, I think, is going to vary from election jurisdiction to election jurisdiction. But that's the way we do things in the United States electoral system. Everything's different everywhere. So, yeah, it's going to be a serious problem. Some places, probably less so others. It's probably far safer to stick it in the mail, assuming the mail actually gets delivered, because for the most part, postal workers actually have a pretty good security culture based on everything I've read and people I've talked to. And they actually have an understanding that they could go to jail if they do any funny business with the mail. So in many ways, that's a more secure situation than you'll have even from professional election workers, much less election judges who are just part-time volunteers, basically. So, yeah, it's a concern, but I don't think the lock is necessarily so much the issue because anything can be quickly opened. You're not going to spend the kind of money you need to have a serious, secure vault for these. That's just not going to happen. So, but it is something to look at. But I think, again, unlike a lot of other security issues, I think this is one security issue that election officials genuinely seem to be aware of and trying to think about. A lot of them, for example, are going to empty the boxes quite frequently.
Right. Well, the only thing that occurs is just we've done some work with the Postal Service, and in a lot of communities, the collection boxes for the post office, they're all keyed alike in a city or on a route. And if this were the case in a major city that had a lot of collection boxes for ballots, that could be a problem, especially as you're keenly aware, the capability, for example, of 3D printing keys, depending on their design.
And, you know, the adversary does face additional penalties from interfering with the mail, which can get pretty serious, in some ways more serious than tampering with votes. But how much of a deterrent that really is, I mean, it is an issue, but again, there's such a huge insider threat in your typical election jurisdiction by when we vote by in person that the trade-off is I really think there's less insider threat by voting by mail. It's not zero.
Yeah.
There are attack modes, there are insider risks, but I think in general, it's typically going to be less in vote by mail.
So based, Roger, in summary, on your experience, spending your whole life in security for the federal government on pretty secure and important areas, especially nuclear security, would you have any concern, or should voters have any concern by voting by mail?
No, I think it's fine. As I say, I believe it's typically, not necessarily in every jurisdiction, but typically going to be more secure. Certainly trying to steal a national election by tampering with vote by mail, that's not going to happen. Could you steal a local election? Yeah, probably, depending on what the election jurisdiction is doing. But you wouldn't do it by messing with the ballots that are mailed in. You would do it by bribing or intimidating election officials inside the election jurisdiction. That's, in a sense, no different whether we vote by mail or vote in person.